This is without a doubt the most food we have ever grown and stored in one single year. Hey friends, welcome back to the DeClerc Homestead. In October, I gave you guys a little bit of a tour of our root cellar and where the food storage was at for the year at that point. But I told you we were far from finished. Even though the gardening season had ended, we still had a lot more food that we were going to be processing. Not only our pigs for the year, but also apples, potatoes, and just all those kind of final end of season things. I promised you that when we were all done putting up food for the year that I would give you an updated tour. So that's what I'm gonna do today. And I'm gonna show you where the root cellar is at storage-wise now. I'm also gonna give you a tour of my freezers and a few tips for how I like to organize those, as well as something I've never shown before on YouTube, and that is my kitchen pantry space, which is actually quite lovely. For being an old house and not having closets in any of the bedrooms, I have a pretty wonderful kitchen pantry, which I'm grateful for. If this is your first time here, let me give you just a little bit of a quick overview of who I'm storing food for. We are a family of 9. All of our kids are still pretty young. Our oldest is 13. So we don't have like teenager appetites to feed, but it still is a lot of people. And we grow the majority of the food that I preserve on our 5-acre homestead in Michigan. All of the meat that we eat is grown here except for the venison. I would say about 75% of the vegetables and fruits that I have preserved are from here. And then of course there are some things that we have to outsource. We get pears from a neighbor. I had to supplement with potatoes from another local farm because we had a terrible crop this year. And we even still have some things that have been purchased from the grocery store too. Shocking, I know. I'm going to show you all of it today. This year, we're really blessed. We have a lot of things that we definitely have more than a year's worth of. But typically our goal is to have enough of each item for one full year. Really excited because at this point of making this video, every single jar that I own is filled with canned goods. Now, by the time I edit and post this video, we will have had a meal and used up some of them. So it won't be true for long, but as I empty jars, I will stash them away for maple syrup later on in the winter. And I do still want to can up some carrots and potatoes, so they'll get kind of used and refilled. I barely made it to the end of our last pig getting everything in jars. I ended up having to put some of the sausage in the freezer, but that's okay. Anyways, we're gonna start down in the root cellar and I will show you around down there. Then we'll come up to the freezers, organize them a little bit, and finally end with the inside pantry. So let's go. Before we head down to the root cellar / canned goods storage area, I actually need to wash up my last 2 batches of plain pork sausage that I took out of the canner yesterday. And I don't know if I've talked about this before, but best practice is definitely to remove the bands and rinse off the outside of your jars. That way, anything that is kind of seeped out during the canning process, especially with things like pork products or even like peaches, things that are kind of sticky, it can build up residue on the outside of your jars that can then end up growing mold, and that's just not ideal. Even though it doesn't affect the food on the inside, it can affect the seal if it builds up enough. So I always try to give them a little bit of a rinse and then, of course, label them so I know what's what. And I usually do 3 different types of canned pork sausage. I do a breakfast seasoning, an Italian seasoning, and a chorizo. But I also did a lot of plain sausage as well this year just because we had 4 pigs that we butchered, which is much more than we normally do. We actually had 6 pigs that we butchered, but 2 of them were roaster size. So they weren't the full weight of a normal pig. So I ended up with some plain sausage, which I can use just like I would ground beef. Obviously, it's different because it's pork, it's fattier. But since we do not have beef this year, we will just substitute this for things like tacos, or whatever else we decide to make. So now that I've got those cleaned up, we can actually head down and put them away. And I'm pretty excited because one of my goals this year was to not only, put away enough food for us to make it to the next growing season when we'd be harvesting that same product again, but I really wanted to see how full I could get these canning shelves. And I pretty much have them maxed out. I think I could maybe fit like 6 more jars if I had them, but I don't. So we've been working really hard to make that happen. The other thing that I've done since I showed you guys the space last is I mentioned I picked up some more potatoes from a local farm just to kind of fill in the gaps of what I didn't have. I like to have a couple 100 pounds of various potatoes in our root cellar. They'll last here all winter long. And about the time they start to sprout, I have empty jars to can them, or I just plant them back in the garden. But here is a whole pan of this space. I'm not sure exactly how many jars I have, but I know that each shelf fits about 100 quarts. There are quite a few pints. Things like jam and pickles are in pint jars, but you can do the math and get a rough idea. The applesauce is also new from the last time I did a tour down here. All of this applesauce was processed in early November. And then I also did restock, no pun intended, my stock with some turkey and chicken stock as well. All of the fruit products are on the left here. And then I have just 1 row left over of potatoes. And the right side here is all of like my vegetables and my proteins and my lard. Whenever I do a tour of the space, I always mention that we are really boring when it comes to our food storage. We don't do a lot of fancy recipes. I kind of can our tried and true, know things that we are going to eat. So there's not a ton of variety. I have all of the meat, not all of it, but a lot of the meats on this top shelf here. The first part being the venison, and then the rest of it is all pork sausage. And it's kind of funny to see that the fat changes colors based on the seasoning that's in there. So the Italian ones, they almost look like green. And then the chorizo is super, super orange. And then the plain is just the more of the white fat. One thing that I think is an easy tip for if you're storing lard, I always put my back fat when it's rendered in quart jars, and then I put the leaf fat in a pint jar, just so it's easy to tell apart. When I need a jar of one or the other, I can send a kid down to grab it. Another new thing that I did this year was I canned up some pulled pork. This was one of the roaster pigs we completely shredded, and I wanted to try canning pulled pork after seeing my friend Chelsea from Little Mountain Ranch do it. And I was afraid it would be mushy, and it's surprisingly not. I would say add a little bit fat back to it when you can it, but otherwise it's going to be a super handy thing to have on the shelf. Here's kind of a view of the rest of the potatoes. I also have a basket of garlic back there and a basket of onions, as well as some hanging onions. And the other thing that I did new this year is I'm storing some carrots in sand. And this is actually the first time I'm peeking at them since I put them in here a little bit over a month ago, I think. Some of them are obviously sprouting, which I have been told is normal, but they look pretty perfect otherwise. I don't plan to tap into these until I've used up all of the carrots that I have just stored in our fridge. So I'm going to leave it for now, but I'm glad to see that they are not drying out or molding or anything like that. I definitely think that I will see if Tommy can put up another shelf or maybe 2 for me next year. Maybe if not for jars, just as somewhere to kind of put these empty boxes so that they're out of the way. But that is the root cellar. in its entirety. Let's move on to the freezer situation. So we have 3 full freezers plus the upper part of the freezer in our scullery fridge. And I like to sort my freezers based on meat. So typically I will have like a red meat freezer, a chicken or a white meat freezer, and then like a vegetables and fruits situation. We don't really have any red meat this year besides a little bit of venison. So this first upright is completely pork, which Mangalitsa pork, if you know, is very, very red compared to other porks. But as we've been kind of processing our pigs, I've been kind of halfway sorting stuff, but I knew once I was done butchering like completely, I was going to have to come back here and organize it a little bit. So one thing that I love to do to organize meat and just kind of make it easier to access all the different cuts is to use totes or even boxes just to kind of keep things separated and neat. I have all of our sausage, so the breakfast sausage links. I also have some venison sticks that I made this year. And then there is some ground sausage that I didn't have enough jars for. So all of our sausage is in this tote that I can now fit on a shelf and pull out easily. And it just stacks much, much nicer than having things kind of shoved onto the shelf. And I'm not going to need these totes again until next year when I start butchering again. And by then I will have used up enough of this meat that it'll be fine to take them out of the freezer. But the way I'm organizing my pork is that I'm putting kind of all of the specialty cuts that we don't have a ton of. So the ribs and tenderloins, which are like kind of one of those things that you don't realize just how cherished they are until you raise your own meat. Like 4 pigs worth of ribs is going to be maybe 2 or 3 meals for us. And my family would definitely eat ribs more often than that. But that's just a really, really special meal when we do have those. I also have an entire half of a shelf of bacon. And I actually have one more batch of bacon that's still curing. And I think we're going to end up having like 80 plus pounds of bacon or so, which is just epic. But that will have an entire half shelf. And then I also have a shelf of roasts. Next to the bacon, I'm putting all of our pork chops. And I think we have some bone-in and some boneless this year. And I decided to put the few extra bacons, and then I just have a couple packages of sausage from last year on the door shelf because then I'll use those up first. And then I have one lamb roast that I actually bartered from somebody with there as well. Otherwise, here is the entire red meat freezer, minus the last batch of bacon and actually one ham that's curing as well. Pretty excited about this haul. I'm really excited to dig into more of those roasts and just a lot of work that went into this entire freezer, both in raising the animal and processing it ourselves. Now let's check into the chicken freezer. This has obviously been tapped into a lot since I think it was September when we processed our final batch of chickens. We do about 100 chickens for ourselves a year, and the majority of them we break down into parts. I do have about a dozen of them that I kept whole this year, but for the most part, we prefer to use parts just because of our family size. It takes multiple birds to feed us otherwise, and there's just a lot more versatility having cuts of chicken versus a whole bird. So the top shelf here, I have all of our drums and then a couple packages of wings on the right side. And then it's all of my boneless, skinless breast and tenders. Then the next shelf is all of our thighs, which is definitely kind of the reject cut. It's the one people always say that they love the most, but I use it the least. Then I have a shelf of kind of just random dairy products, butter and cheese, some more wings, and then in the door of this one, I have a bunch of several gallons of buttermilk, some chicken fat that I need to render down, some pesto, and then I also like to store all of my extra jars of yeast in here as well. Yeast is just one of those things that I feel like it's really important to have on hand. I can do sourdough, but I don't enjoy it and I don't care to. So We used yeast for most of our baked goods, and it's just a really inexpensive thing to stock up on and always have on hand. So that's basically it for the chicken freezer. Last but not least is the little one above the fridge, well, and the chest freezer. This is mostly where I put my vegetables. I have some stock in here, some chocolate chips, and I also have cream cheese and some store-bought bagels. This is kind of where I put like the majority of my vegetables and fruits if I have them. If I get frozen pizzas, I throw them in here, that kind of stuff. I would show you the chest freezer, but it's not very accessible right now. It's mainly just odds and ends, chicken feet, whole chickens. I have a hide in there from our steer last year. It's not that exciting in there, so I will have to clean that off another day and maybe show you guys. Now let's go inside. So there are actually 2 spaces I store food in the kitchen. This cupboard is kind of my things that are in small quantities. So I have all of the small baked goods like my baking powder, my baking soda, my gallon jar of flour. And then on the right here, I have like all of my seasonings or spices. There's 2 shelves of those. The upper shelf is kind of just an overflow or doubles. And then I have a drawer of all of like my dried nuts and fruits and chia seeds and that kind of stuff that I use when baking or making snacks and stuff. I also have a shelf that just has some tuna here and some syrup, and then it's mainly just packaging thing beyond that. So not a ton going on in this cupboard. I also need to make the disclaimer. The pantry that I'm about to show you is about the cleanest state that you'll ever see it, because Evelyn, my oldest, just did a lot of work reorganizing it. This is not the normal state of it, unfortunately, but I'm hopeful that maybe we can maintain it now that it is at this point. In here, I have a ton of different buckets of dried goods. I have flour, oats, rice, brown sugar, white sugar, salt, cornmeal, all of that stuff. And then I have all of my kind of store-bought staples. So there's noodles, there's a bunch of condiments, I have extra dish soap, vinegars, and if I have any like fruit or convenience foods like granola bars or tortilla chips, I'll put them in here. And then there's also some root veggies. A lot of these things I probably would have been ashamed to share that I buy at one point, but I'm not as much as a purist as I once was. Yes, my goal is to feed my family nourishing foods. Yes, I know how to make homemade condiments and even noodles, but in different seasons of life, different things are priority. And right now, these are the things that make sense for us to buy. So I buy the best quality that I can justify based on our budget, and I just leave it at that. I hope you guys enjoyed the tour of our food storage. If there's any questions you have or details that I missed, feel free to leave a comment below. I'm gonna go warm up by the wood stove. I'll talk to you guys later.